Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the smiling faces who I see and those who I see every day in our Daf Yomi. It's great to see everyone. Hello from Prague. Hello to Forest Hills. That's amazing. Feel free to let me know in the chat where you're learning Torah from today. We are today during Daf. We will, or maybe if you've learned today's daf, you finished a perek. You finished the first chapter of Masachet Ketubot. So pat yourself on the back. Really exciting adventure into Masachet Ketubot. Now, Masachet Ketubot, this tractate is known as a mini shas, like a mini version of the entire Talmud. And if you have learned the pages up until now, you know this is true. We've hit on so many different issues, from kosher to the laws of damages, to the laws of marriage, of course, being central, to the laws of mourning. There are so many different things that we're seeing today. And if you recall, we are going to begin on around Daf 10, and looking at where we left off on last week's pages, there was an amazing comparison between the laws of Sheva Brachot, the laws of celebrating for a wedding, and the laws of what? Comparison in the chat. Put it in the chat. The comparison of the 7 days of celebration after a wedding to the laws of for the mourning, exactly, the laws of mourning. Now, if you've never thought about this comparison before, the Gemara this week really elucidated some pretty interesting comparisons. And I think it's important to remember, just communally, we take a Shiva very seriously, right? The way we support those in need in our community who've lost a loved one. But what we saw on this week's daf actually is that it is parallel to the experience of celebrating somebody and their joy as well. 7 days of obligated celebration for someone who's never been married before, though there is a difference for a woman who has not been married before. And there was a debate, who had been married before. And there was a debate about what if the man had been married before as well. So what's really interesting, the sub and meta question above it all is, are there different gradations of joy? And are there different gradations of mourning as well? And as we enter this period of time in the Jewish calendar, kind of really getting quickly to the 9th of Av, which is all about grief and mourning, it's very interesting to think about in the realm of Masachet Ketubot of this tractate. What does it mean to have obligated joy and obligated grief? Like, what does it mean to have practices that push us towards one thing or the other? Beautiful, Richard. Thank you for that comment in the chat. I'm very sorry about that loss, but wow, what an amazing thing about Jewish life that really this daf showed us, that it's about sometimes holding the happy and the sad, the joyous and the grief all at once, really. We even saw this specific case that Richard is mentioning here. What happens if the two actually collide and you have to engage in mourning and in grief? How do you set one aside to make room for the other? How do both coexist? All right, we got to get going. Daf 10, we're going to start our little journey. One thing that you see here, you might have cringed during this daf, because we see here there are really tests that were given to women about whether or not they had sex before. In my class, and this is something I wonder if the last Daf Yomi highlights person shared, I don't love using the word virgin. I think it's been used historically in very violent ways. So something I say in my own class is I either use the term bisula, which is the Hebrew term for a woman who's never had sex before, or I just say that. But there's this test, right? Has she had sex before? And how do they do it? Well, she gets placed on a barrel of wine, and it's tested to see if the scent of the wine actually comes through the top of her mouth, right? And if so, it's proof that she's had sex before. If not, she hasn't. Wow. Okay. Well, on the redemptive side of all of this, if you notice in these little debates about claims of whether or not he comes forward and he's like, I think my bride has had sex before. So what's interesting is if you notice the bride is with him, right? They go together to the court the morning after the wedding. So I like to notice whenever women seem to be more involved in the legal process than we might have expected. So she's coming with him. Also a reminder, the stakes of this claim are not just that he's mad, that he has to pay more for his ketubah. Remember, the amounts are different, 100 versus 200. That's not the only issue. The other issue is a question of, can they even be together anymore? Because if it happened to be that she had had sex with someone during the time of their erusin, their betrothal period, they actually become forbidden to each other. So you can imagine a situation where they are wondering, wait, are we even allowed to be together anymore? So I'm just sharing that to remind you that the stakes are not only his claim for the money, right? It's a little bit, there's another level as well. Okay. So another incident that happened on Daf 10 that I must share because it's fascinating. There was a question of a woman who is brought by her husband the day after the wedding. It said, my wife didn't bleed, right? There was no hymenal bleeding. I'm bringing a claim to the court. And she's like, no. Our family doesn't bleed. That's just a thing. Like, our family doesn't bleed. It's so interesting, right? Like, what's the reality of this particular family? Perhaps there was some sort of sterility potion. I have no idea. But they get comforted by Rabban Gamliel, who says, wow, it's so wonderful that you're married to a woman from this family. And then there's this back and forth about whether or not that's really good, because ultimately, just as yeast is beneficial to dough, so is the amount of blood beneficial to a woman. Which gives us, first of all, it's a little like period positivity here. But that's beyond that. It's an interesting thing because they understood menstrual blood as actually more like semen than like the shedding of uterine lining, right? They believed that blood was going to help create children in the future. Okay, so there's that interesting exchange in Masachet Ketubot on Daf 10. Let's keep going a little bit. I just want to remind everyone, I love your comments in the chat. They can be questions, they can be comments, they can be snark, whatever you want. I will try to look at them as I talk. We're continuing through the daf. I'm on Daf 10b. We saw a question, where does the word almana come from? Where does the word widow come from? Well, the answer is it comes from the fact that she gets a mana, 100, as a part of her ketubah. And they incredulously say, what do you mean she gets 100 as a result for her ketubah? And that's where the word comes from. Did they have rabbinic ketubahs at the time the Tanakh was written, right? So it's like, the answer is, yeah, sometimes there are hints to the future in the Tanakh, which is quite an interesting thing. Okay, so let's continue a little bit more. You have, if you are on, I'm just trying to think more about linguistics, right? The Daf 10 was almost 100% about linguistics and where words come from. And my question for you, and I asked my shiur this as well, my class this as well, what on earth is a discussion about linguistics doing in this Mishnah? Right, about defining the amount of a ketubah. They go back and forth about, well, why is a ladder called a ladder? Why is a bed called a bed? By the way, a bed is called a bed, a poria, because that's where pru or vu happens. That's where fertility exploits happen, right? And so therefore the word for bed is similar to the word for fertility. Okay, so that is a question. We will leave it up in the air. You don't know the answer, but it's an interesting point. All right, Daf 11. Very, very important Talmudic concept comes up on Daf 11. You can benefit a person in their absence. That is going to be a concept that comes up again and again and again. You can benefit a person in their absence, but you may not disadvantage a person in their absence. So this comes up in all sorts of legal discussions in the Talmud, but here it's about the conversion of a minor. And the meta question is it a benefit to the child to be converted without their presence or understanding? Now, obviously, this is very relevant to how we do conversions for minors today. We say that minors don't have the proper age of consent. So what does that mean? We can convert a minor if we're really doing something without their consent. Well, maybe it's a benefit for them, and you can do that without their consent if it's a benefit. And then the Gemara gets into a really interesting discussion. Is it really a benefit to be a convert, right? Because ultimately, wouldn't it be great to not follow all the laws of the Torah, right? So there's this back and forth, which I think is very, very important. about whether or not it's a totally great thing to convert, right? Maybe it's actually complicated for a person. You can't say that it's across the board 100% a benefit for this child. We ultimately say it is a benefit for the child if their parents or parent practices in that way, because they would like to do what their parents are doing. They would like to share the religion of their household, which of course is how we rule today in many communities. Okay. Janine, I'm going to get to that in a little bit. So in the rest of the daf on 11, we talk about a child being able to renounce their conversion over time. And that was that little Mishnah on daf 11. Okay. We continue in daf 11b about what's called a mukat eitz. All right, introducing another Talmudic concept, this idea that a woman can present as someone who has had sex before, but it's due to other physiological changes instead of actually it being because of a sexual act. That's called in Hebrew mukat eitz, or in English, a wood injury victim. We don't really want to think about that, but the idea is that their hymen gets stretched for other reasons besides sexual intercourse. And there's a debate about whether or not that affects the ketubah and how it affects the ketubah. And that really is the back and forth on daf 11. All right. So we talk about, is it 200 or is it 100? Similarly, we understand, we start to engage in a question of, when do we believe women? Major question here. When do we hold a woman's experience as totally true? If you look on daf 11b, if she says, I had my hymen stretched by a piece of wood, and the man's like, no, you didn't, you had sex, who do we believe? Right? Now, Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say, we believe her. We believe her. And the idea is, Bari Vishema, Bari Adif, that if you have a situation of certainty and a maybe, the certainty always takes precedence. Now, she's certain about her own experience. He does not know. He can only guess about at what point she had sex and with who and all these things, but she is able to speak with certainty about her own experience. In general, I find it really helpful in the daf. And sometimes, and I don't know, the ketubot is such a great tractate to just brush up on Jewish concepts and rabbinic concepts in general. But sometimes I write on the top of my Gemara like a meta question that's going on in the page. This page is about believing the statements of women, right? That's really quite interesting here. Under this. All right. We also discussed the issue of mekach ta'ut, a mistaken transaction, right? So can he say, when he discovers that she has indeed had sex before, or she is a mukat eitz, what's called a wood injury victim, can this man say, actually, I didn't mean to marry you. I shouldn't have married you. And therefore, let's go back on the whole thing. And you don't get any ketubah. Would that be possible? So that is discussed also on daf 11. Before I get to daf 12, any questions, any thoughts? Get in the chat. Say anything you would like. I do see that there's a lot of cringing in this masachet. It's actually a really good question, how it is you approach these pages, right? It's very hard to get through if it would be hard to get through in a full cringe, right? So sometimes, and what could be helpful to do is figuring out, what is the experience? Let's just try to get into the experience of what's going on here. And then, of course, keep our reactions with us throughout the process, but also try to understand. Okay. Oh, thank you, Betsy. I don't know what you're referring to, but thank you so much. All right. So continuing on daf 12, you have this question of presumption. Who can we assume that a person is marrying? And in this context, we learn about differing customs across the Jewish people. And I would like you, now I'm trying to engage you. This is called the pedagogy of Zoom. Let's see how it works. What are the strangest or most interesting wedding customs you've seen? Different, diverse wedding customs, Jewish wedding customs, because that's the topic of daf 12. except this wedding custom is about what happens upon betrothal, right? Anybody see like the show Married at First Sight or like those kinds of shows? They're very bad. So this is not an advertisement for that show. But yeah, so Neri's saying, oh, this really interesting wedding custom of getting engaged and then sleeping together, right? Or being secluded together. That was the custom in Judea. In Judea, they would actually meet each other and then spend their engagement time, could be up to a year, together in seclusion, right? Like all of you were saying in the chat. And this would allow the couple to get familiar with one another. We also learned about the custom to appoint shushbinin, which are essentially groomsmen and bridesmaids who had a very different goal than groomsmen and bridesmaids have today. Today, it's to look pretty and walk down the aisle and get the groom and bride whatever they need, whatever it is. But here, what was their job? Their job was to make sure there was no funny business, to make sure she is not previously staining her sheets with wine or something like that, and to make sure he's not hiding evidence. So, I mean, here's like my takeaway from this week in the Daf. This is about an economic transaction, right? A marriage seems to be about that, even to the point where they're so concerned about this economic transaction that they're appointing witnesses to make sure no one messes with evidence. I mean, come on. This is not like the weddings that we are familiar with today. We saw at the end of last week's stuff, the beautiful Sheva Brachot, all of these theological underpinnings of marriage. But then we get into the real nitty gritty of the economic advantages, disadvantages, and accusations, really. And so that's what we're protecting against in this context. Thank you for the wedding customs as well. Great question from Larry. What is amigo? What is amigo? And I told my Daf class this, but I used to like learning Talmud on the subway in New York City when I was studying at Yeshivat Maharat. I would bring my big Gemara onto the subway. And often there are other people learning Torah on the subway in New York City. And I remember I got up to this concept, Larry, of migo, and I just couldn't understand it for the life of me. And so I turned to this like Haredi guy, this ultra-Orthodox guy on the subway. And I'm like, can you explain amigo to me? And he did. So in the spirit of that man, I'm going to share with you what amigo is. Amigo is when you admit something to someone else and you could have made a claim that would have been more to your advantage. Okay. So there are many different iterations of that. But if she comes forward and says, I'm a wood injury victim, right? My hymen is indeed stretched, but it didn't come from sex, right? That is more, why didn't she say, I never had sex at all? Right? Why didn't she just reject the claim? That's called amigo. And she could have said something more to her advantage, but instead she chooses to say something that really is more believable because it's less to her advantage. So that is amigo. Okay, so we are in the differing wedding customs of the Judea and the Galilee. All right, Daf 12. We are getting to our current Daf, almost there. Really bizarre case of a court of Kohanim. Look at the Mishnah on Daf 12 if you like. We learned that if there's a widow who is the daughter of Kohanim, there would be a court of Kohanim who would collect lots of money for both a besula of someone who's never had sex before and a widow of Kohanim. They would collect extra money, more than the other people would collect, more than the rabbis for a non-Kohen Jew would collect. What was the standard ketubah amount, everybody in the chat? Standard ketubah amount for someone who's never been married before. 200, right? 200 zuz. What about the reduced amount generally in the chat? 100 slash Ben, I like that. 100. It's great. Here, the Kohanim are saying what? 400. 400 is the Kohen price. Right? And we had this amazing discussion. Like, what does this mean? They can have like an extra ketubah price for Kohanic women. And the sages, according to the Mishnah, do not protest this practice of the Kohanim. Again, emphasizing the economic nature of all of this, right? The Kohanim were concerned that people were treating widows who were Kohanim or from the family of Kohanim lightly, and they tried to up the price so as to reinforce how important it was to be a Kohen. Now, we don't often see, I think probably only one or two other times in the entire Talmud, we see this weird grouping of a court of Kohanim. That's something strange. So there's a debate about whether they were part of the larger Sanhedrin, were they a separate court who dealt with matters of the Kohanim, but it's also another reminder. And I saw a question of let me just see from, I'm sorry, I missed it. A question about Kohanic lineage. It really just underscores the importance of lineage as well. Okay, so that was Daf 12. Okay, next Daf. Let's go on to Daf 12b, Daf 13 as well. Another important halachic concept. What brings a claim to be believed in general? Specifically, a monetary claim. Well, if someone says, you borrowed money from me and now you owe me, who do we believe, right? Well, there's an important set of concepts to learn here, and we're going to go over them right now because they're going to come up again and again and again. I'm going to put it in the chat. I mentioned this before. All right. So first, you have the concept of bari v'shema, bari adif. So that means if you have a certain claim versus an uncertain claim, then what do you believe? Certain, right? Always. The certain claim wins. So that's one concept. But then you have another concept that we always leave the money in the possession of the current owner unless proof is provided otherwise, right? So you can't extract money from someone else. You can't be like, you owe me money without producing any proof. The money stays with its owner. That's called oki mamona b'chazkas mare. You leave the money in its current place, wherever it is. All right. So that was an important concept on Daf 12. We also learned the concept of migo in Daf 12. All right, so getting to Daf 13, I'm just looking at our time here, so I want to make sure to get to some of the issues on today's Daf. All right, what about secluding oneself in a ruin? Right, we talked about euphemisms of what it means to be secluded, right? What does it mean to actually see someone walk into a secluded place? Can you assume they're having sex? Or even is the Mishnah talking about a euphemism for having sex? We talked about a ruin, different kinds of ruins, and who to believe in that context. Now, finally, on today's daf, we see a very, very complicated issue in Jewish law. The issue of rov, the majority. When you have a case where you're not sure of the status of an object or a person, how do you rule, right? How do you figure out what the majority is, and can you rule like the majority? We saw the case on today's daf of, God forbid, a girl who is raped, who is assaulted, and we don't know who did it, and it affects her status in marrying a Kohen. Now, why would it affect her status in marrying a Kohen? Because if the person who slept with her was a mamzer, or of what's called, at least in the article translation, someone of not fit lineage, right, then she would not be able to marry a Kohen. So this is very unfortunate situation has come before the court. Now, how do we rule? Well, what we ended up learning on today's daf is that we have to know where the majority lies, both in the traveling caravan that was coming by at the time of the assault and in terms of the city. And in general, we looked at a number of cases about how to rule when you're not sure about the specific nature of an object. We looked at meat, different kinds of meat, 9 from a kosher store, 1 from a non-kosher store, and my favorite on today's daf, 9 frogs and 1 sheretz. 1 creepy crawly. You don't know which one is which. Yes, Anne, I try to be careful about it, but it's a great point. I think just to be totally transparent, I would like to not throw the second word around as much as possible. So sometimes I use the softer term, but that is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about assault and rape in the second case on today's daf. One final concept we're going to look at today is spake sveka. This was an important concept that came up throughout the entire week of the daf, and it is very Jewish. It is a very Jewish concept. So can anyone put in the chat, what is a safek? What is a safek? Does anybody know that word? No worries at all, Anne. I'm good. Doubt, right? It's a case of doubt, safek. Now, a spake sveka is a doubt upon a doubt, a double doubt. And in the case of a double doubt, you can rule leniently. And this is really important in many different areas of Jewish law. Let's say you call up the rabbi about any sort of question that you're not sure about the answer, whether it's about the kitchen and kosher or other kinds of questions. Some of the clarifying questions that are going to be asked are about, well, at what points were there doubts, right? Because if there's a double doubt, then we can rule leniently in this particular context. Now, a way that this manifests in our daf is, let's say the man comes forward and says, hey, this woman has had sex before, and he comes to the court and he claims this. Well, there's a double doubt sometimes. There's a doubt about whether or not it was the hymenal change was from sex or from something else. And the second doubt is whether or not it happened while they were betrothed. Right. So it's two doubts, and that will come up throughout the tractate as well. It is 9:58. Any final questions or comments in the chat? I know I'm like yelling. It's because I get excited by the Gemara. Okay. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're here. Yeah. So it's a good question. And I think iPhone, I don't know your name. Hello, iPhone. What the different kinds of sexual relationships are, actually, it does make a difference. Sometimes, though, like in this case we learned on today's daf, the reason we're looking at an assault as opposed to a consensual sexual relationship is because we end up not knowing who committed it, right? It's like a little bit like she went out to this field or whatever it is to get the water, and it was not clear who did it and how it happened. And so it's in that context that we're asking the questions. No, they are not. And we're gonna, for Janine, we're gonna look at later on in around 10 days. So stay tuned, the penalties for assault as well. Thank you, everyone. 9:59. I love learning with you. It's the grandest thing in the world. So thank you so much, Ben, MJL, for a wonderful week. And again, I just want to, in our last minute, tell you about a personal practice of mine when I learned through Masachet Ketubot. Remember, I forgot who it was, said it was cringeworthy sometimes, like it's hard to read. I actually have a special tzedakah jar, a charity jar, that when the Gemara is difficult and says something particularly violent towards women, I put money in the jar. And it actually goes to a women's organization when it gets full. So if you'd like to do that, you are welcome to do that as well. It helps me, and it might help you too. All right, everyone. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Rabbanit Dasi. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We'll see you next week. Take good care.